Good afternoon, everyone. It is on behalf of the Association of Former Staff Members of UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Cultural, and Scientific Organization, that I host this interview with Professor Aaron Benavot on the subject of the engagement of the United States government, and beyond that, the engagement of the research, academic, and practitioner community of the USA with UNESCO. The motivating factor for this interview was a recent declaration by the Comparative and International Education Society, CIES, concerning the imperious need for the US to re-engage with UNESCO under the incoming presidency of Joe Biden, President of the United States of America. I am Alexandra Draxler, former UNESCO staff member who spent many years in UNESCO's education sector. It is my pleasure and privilege to introduce you, Aaron Benavot, professor in the Department of Educational Policy and Leadership at the School of Education of the University of Albany, part of the State University of New York. Aaron has spent almost 8 years at UNESCO, first as senior analyst at UNESCO's Education for All Global Monitoring Report from 2005 to 2009, then as director of the newly named Global Education Monitoring Report from 2013 to 2017. He has a long and active relationship with the Comparative and International Education Society since 1987, and was among those who proposed a recent declaration by its board that we'll talk about later, affirming its support for the re-engagement of the US with UNESCO. So you talk a little bit about the Comparative and International Education Society, and then describe how the board came to make a declaration concerning re-engagement with UNESCO.
Sure, my pleasure. The US-based Comparative and International Education Society is one of about 45, 47 comparative education societies that exist around the world. They are all members of something called the World Council of Comparative Education Societies. It is important to note that the WCCS is in fact has a special NGO status with UNESCO. CIS itself does not, but through its membership in the WCCS, it is an accredited NGO from UNESCO, which is important to keep in mind later on. So it is invited to some of the big international meetings that UNESCO convenes and so on and so forth. But CIS is the oldest and indeed the largest of the comparative and international education societies in the world. It was founded in 1956. It currently has more than 3,000 members that represent many different kinds of institutions, universities, colleges, research institutes, government departments, NGOs, and so on. In many ways, it's grown fairly dramatically. I remember as a graduate student attending the CIS meetings, there were maybe 400 or 500 people. Usually it took place at a university. It was a very, there were lots of kind of big debates, many of them very ideological and theoretical. I would say that the association has experienced a certain professionalization. I would say there are two things that have happened. One, there are many new professionally or practice-oriented groups that are very keen now to participate in the annual meeting at CIS. Many of these are engaged, many of these organizations or NGOs are involved themselves in various kinds of studies and evidence-based research or policy-oriented research. And so they often come to report the findings from the work that they're doing and to discuss with colleagues, hear about up-to-date work that various academics and researchers have been engaged in. And the other part of it that I think accounts for its incredible expansion over the last couple of decades is that as US colleges and universities have grown their international education programs and brought in a lot more international students, many of them studied in schools of education, studied the field of comparative education, were very interested in this. And when they returned to their countries, they often, or even sometimes when they were still in the US as part of their graduate or PhD training, they might have attended one of the CIS meetings, found it to be a fairly friendly and likable environment to engage with other
Right.
students and whatnot. And so upon their return, they have continued to be members. I believe something in the order of about 35% of the membership of CIS is based outside of North America. So it's a very international organization now that represents not just US-based academics, but researchers and practitioners and policy analysts around the world. It basically is involved in every kind of educational research or policy-oriented research you could imagine, cross-national, qualitative case studies, everything from early childhood to university, lifelong learning, non-formal, really the whole gamut of concerns of researchers and policy analysts are often found in the organization. To your point about the statement, so as you noted in the opening, this relationship between the US and UNESCO has gone through many different phases. Let's say it's been contentious to say the least, which often has involved the US leaving or defunding and then coming back and whatnot. And CIS, because its members have been involved with UNESCO, either organizationally, through the WCCS, or I would say much more dramatically as individual members, let's say as UNESCO chairs, but often in many other kinds of contributions in terms of commissioned work, and some of them have worked at UNESCO. They've taken leave of absence, such as I did, from academic positions, or they've been involved. For example, Karen Mundy, who's a past president of CIS, is now on UNESCO's Futures of Education Commission.
Right.
Sobi, who's also an ex-president, is involved in the same initiative.
Right.
So there are many different members, that have been involved in UNESCO activities, and so they're keenly aware of the contested politics between the US government and the UN generally and UNESCO in particular. And they have, over the course of over the course of the last decade, articulated. The board of directors of CIS has put out statements in support of the US government's continued funding and engagement with UNESCO. And I think that, as I understand it, from the current president, Iveta Silova, several CIS members with the results of the last election saw an opening and a possibility, and asked that the organization take a proactive role in making a clear statement that would be convened to the incoming Biden-Harris administration. The CIS president then asked, they have a committee, it's called the Ad Hoc Committee for Social and Policy Engagement, that reviewed the statement. Then it was also discussed by the board. And then eventually, several weeks ago, the statement came out that calls on the Biden administration to rejoin UNESCO and to re-engage in all areas of the organization's expertise, both with respect to culture, education, science, information, and communication. So CIS sees itself as, perhaps because of its own mission, because of the work of its members, sees enormous alignment with many of the goals and particular activities of the organization. So they are very keen for the US to return as a full dues-paying member of the organization. And I think that was the overall motivation to ensure that there are voices that are voices that very much committed, US-based voices that are very much committed to having the US return to UNESCO.
Thank you for that, Aaron. And I might add that, many of CIES members, in my experience, are also very engaged in the educational development worldwide. They act as consultants and researchers and on development projects. And so it's a key partner for the educational development community all over the world. There are other initiatives. There's one that I shared with you about a large number of NGOs and quasi-governmental organizations of the US concerning UNESCO's future and supporting the return of UNESCO or the re-engagement of UNESCO of United States communities with UNESCO. Do you have anything to say about the overall mobilization of the education community to support UNESCO, or do you think we've said enough on that topic?
Well, I mean, I know that the World Council of Comparative Education Societies, which is not based in the US, also came out with a statement of support. I know that the main educational research association, the AERA, has also been discussing potentially coming out with a statement.
Mm-hmm.
In the past, there have been other associations, academic associations, that have voiced their support. National Librarians Association and some other professional organizations that have sought to influence US policy with respect to
Right.
UNESCO. I think that now, from what I understand, I would say that there are two kinds of initiatives. One is, let's say, more organized around the education community,
Mm-hmm.
and the main initiative, I think, is the one that you were referring to, which is through the Global Campaign for Education, which is a kind of an umbrella movement that includes many NGOs, both local, national, and otherwise. And they put out, as I'm sure you've seen, a kind of a 6-point
Right.
policy paper. The second point makes reference to this is a policy paper that is meant to come to the committees that are preparing for the new administration.
Right.
And basically the second point talks about the US restoring its leadership in global education by supporting multilateral organizations with the experience and technical capacity to respond to current and ongoing needs. And the first specific point that they talk about is the rejoining of UNESCO as a full member and its continued support of the UN. So they've clearly articulated this. I know that they have had the executive director with whom I've been in touch with, Jennifer Rigg, has been involved in some exchanges with the teams that are working for the incoming Biden
Right.
administration. I believe also the UN Foundation is also
Interesting.
involved in some initiative,
Mm-hmm.
although their focus is much more on multilateralism and
Right.
US engagement in the UN more generally, and not UNESCO specifically. So, they're pushing for the US to return to the WHO and such things. But I would say that the GCE, the US branch of the GC, has been at the forefront of trying to organize, partly
Right.
because the location, they're located in Washington. They have very strong networks that they've
Right.
developed over the years, trying to impact
Right.
American policy, both in terms of international aid, and in particular with respect to refugees and emergency aid,
Right.
funding of for education in emergencies and so on and so forth. So they have a strong track record of really knowing, who to contact and how to, try to get agenda items to be noticed by some
Right.
of the decision makers.
Yeah, and it's also we can remark on the fact that the Global Campaign for Education statement is some of the signatories are major contractors for USAID, And indeed, some of them are actually funded by USAID. So that means that there's support within agencies of the United States government as well for re-engaging with UNESCO, which could be very encouraging. Sort of one of the last questions I have is, this is a topic that you've done a lot of thinking about multilateralism being under threat from a number of quarters. And we see that in many ways in the UN system and in general, particularly with the past administration, but not only. Do you feel that agreement and collaboration around international research and policies concerning education can be a unifying force because it's perhaps less political than other kinds of multilateral cooperation? Is that a question you'd like to make a few
Well, I mean,
remarks about?
I can briefly make a couple comments. I don't think of myself as a particular expert in this area, but I think that you and I would agree that in some ways the U.S. is fairly exceptional in how little support, let's say broad public support, there is for a kind of multilateral engagement. If you live and work in the European continent, and certainly in many other parts of the world, I've spent a lot of time in East Asia, in Latin America, in the Middle East. There's a lot of engagement, whether it be at the regional level or the international level, with countries working, in consort to achieve kind of broader purposes and broader goals. And the U.S., obviously for certain historical reasons, but also because of its size and its powerful position in the global economy and so on, has tended to be a bit of a, kind of a loner, or at least most of the general population has not seen multilateral engagement as being a high priority. Only maybe during times of war and international conflict where the U.S. Needs to maybe take a leadership role, but certainly can't do it by itself. So your question, there have been certain areas, certainly under the purview of UNESCO, such as the World Heritage Sites, that I think a lot of American tourists are certainly keen on. UNICEF has been much more engaged with the American population because of its ability to be a fundraiser and all the very creative ways that they have done fundraising to support early childhood and children around the world. UNESCO doesn't have that option. And so, most people think of the UN as being a bloated, kind of a big bureaucratic association, that there's a lot of talk and not a lot of real action or important work that gets done. Obviously, these perceptions, are very much, how should we say, mediated by the media, and so I think that the deeper problem has been the ways in which political leaders or political elites or those that are, let's say, more cognizant of the potential value and benefits of multilateralism have gone soft or have reneged on their commitment or see it as much more problematic. And so that, to me, in other words, trying to impact the general populace is probably not going to go too far. But I think trying to ensure that the political leadership and policy analysts and people who are more cognizant of a kind of a cosmopolitan perspective about world affairs, it is important to bring, to engage them about what specific activities UN agencies, including UNESCO, are involved in, and how this both benefits, world peace or whatever, but also has even direct benefits for the US and US citizens. So I think UNESCO certainly has, could do more in order to impress upon, the leadership both in Congress and in the administration about the many ways in which they are involved in activities that are either directly or indirectly of importance to the U.S. Going forward.
Yeah, that's very, very interesting from your perspective because you really have a handle on the topics that get traction in the academic and research and development community concerning education. So, what do you think are the key areas are that might attract more interest in the United States and that might cement a larger percentage of let's not talk about the general population, but the professional education population in for UNESCO. I mean, you've spearheaded, 8 or 9 topics at the Global Education Monitoring Report, and you know which ones are the ones that really attract the attention of the research and academic community. Would you like to comment on that?
So I would say two things, or kind of follow in two different directions. One is that UNESCO played an incredibly important role in the development of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and in particular the formulation of the 10 targets and even the global indicators that have been specified and adopted by 195 countries of the UN.
Right.
And the fact of the matter is that the education agenda that currently is kind of the international policy agenda in education is the broadest, most comprehensive, most holistic agenda that has ever been conceived. There are opportunities here for every kind of, let's say, research that one might conceive of in many different directions. And so this was not always the case with it, with under EFA. There was
Right.
a much narrowly, more narrowly focused agenda, and the agenda was mainly about countries in the global South, whereas the new agenda is a universal agenda. It's much more outcome oriented. It's a very learning centric or learning focused agenda. And so many different skills and research that is taking place by US-based comparative education researchers and policy analysts really have a lot to contribute to understanding both progress that's being made and also some of the obstacles and issues or challenges that countries are facing in trying to make progress. Um, and so I think that the academic community really has an opportunity here. I don't think that they've fully engaged as much as they possibly possibly could, partly because of certain biases or interests in, let's say, formal education, less on lifelong learning and other kinds of things. But in any case, I see a huge opportunity here. And so I would hope that, comparative educationalists here in the US would work in that direction. The other issue is a little bit different, and that really, I think, is the question about the impact of the COVID pandemic. So, UNESCO very quickly understood that it needed to organize a coalition of interested educational stakeholders to try and, first of all, describe what has occurred in many parts of the world in terms of the interruption of the provision of education and the enormous inequalities that have been exacerbated as a consequence of COVID. And so they've tried to move fairly quickly and brought together different people, and they have provided a lot of interesting material. And the fact of the matter is that the COVID has certainly had a huge negative impact in terms of access and continuity and learning, but it's also opened up a lot of spaces for let's say innovation and institutional change that in the past would have been almost inconceivable because of all kinds of structural obstacles.
Right.
But rethinking examinations and rethinking the traditional forms of pedagogy and trying to reimagine quality education and so on and so forth. And so actually the possibilities for the American kind of comparative education community or education research committee to take up, to think about the future and some of these kind of innovations that have innovate opportunities for innovative work in the field of education, I think is another very interesting opportunity. And the question is again, how much do people kind of take up or seize the day, as it were, and find ways to maybe adjust some of their current interest in order to use their own, knowledge and expertise and whatnot, and try to engage with some of these emergent challenges and also emergent opportunities. So one is this kind of the international education policy, which has a longer, let's say, a horizon of 10 to 15 years, but also the immediate impact of the pandemic and how it's impacted education systems around the world, including from the US, in the US. And, I've had students, for example, in a course that I taught in comparative education this last semester, that I said to them, there's a lot to be learned from, let's say, the education and emergency literature that could be in some sense adapted or embraced or reconsidered in light of some of the challenges that local school districts, let's say here in the state of New York, are facing in relationship to remote learning and trying to provide quality education for their children. So I think that there's a lot of, and many of these are principals or people in positions of some leadership in the local school districts. They begin to see other ways in which the field of comparative education can actually speak or provide another window or another kind of a platform for them to see other potential policies or activities or interventions that potentially could be valuable, given what we've experienced these last few months. So I think both of these things are really important.
That's really interesting. Thank you so much. And it's true that as the role of COVID in driving accelerated inequalities comes to the forefront, that there is a relationship between UNESCO and much poorer countries and learning from each other about how to overcome these inequalities. I think you're absolutely right. Well, to our concluding sort of remarks, do you have any comments about other actions that might be taken to encourage the U.S. to come back to UNESCO? And have we missed anything? And would you like to just wrap up with a few final remarks?
I mean, I think that there are those who might say that this is trying to get the U.S. to come back to UNESCO is a very complex and complicated process. It's very different from, let's say, the disengagement with the WHO, which the new administration can kind of overturn a decision made by the previous administration fairly quickly. I think, those who are in the know feel that there's a longer history, much of it contested, and all kinds of other kinds of obstacles that would need to be engaged. But I think that it's important to keep in mind there are really two different kinds of statuses, or two ways that the U.S. can come back. Any member state of the UN, the executive branch of that country, can request to become a member of UNESCO, regardless of the dues. In other words, for many years after, as you mentioned, the Palestinian thing, the US stopped funding UNESCO, but it remained a member of UNESCO for at least 5 or 6 years. And it was engaged in various UNESCO activities. It was involved in the executive board. It was involved in all kinds of discussions that went on at the institution. So even though they weren't paying dues, they were still a member of the organization. And so I think that it may be a lot simpler, for us to basically say to the new administration, let's go back to the kind of the status quo ante. Let's go back to a situation, at least initially, where the US comes back And,
Mhm.
and before it, we work out this whole question about the dues paying,
Right.
and also paying, the amount in arrears, but also the existing. That can be negotiated probably quietly, among the cabinet of the DG at UNESCO
Mhm.
and the representatives of the US administration. It doesn't have to happen overnight, but the US can come back fairly, easily. It isn't such a big deal. And I think that obviously UNESCO would very much embrace that. And the situation has changed. The new DG has been very politically astute, and all the kinds of political contested issues that let's say were more characteristic of the UNESCO executive board in the past. They've gotten their kind of financial house in order. They have a lot to be proud of in terms of kind of getting
Right.
things, even though their budget has been reduced dramatically, but they have a much better organized house today, politically, financially, and otherwise. And so there's really very little reason, for the U.S. not to re-engage, even at the basic level of becoming a non-dues paying member, and then to work out, the other kinds of issues, both on, this side of the Atlantic and potentially, in Paris on the other side of the Atlantic. So I would hope that, what should we say, um, intelligent minds or people who of good faith will understand that there's much to be gained and little to be lost by having the U.S. Re-engage with UNESCO. I think it would be enormously beneficial, certainly for the organization, but also for the international comparative education community. And so I fully support every effort that's being undertaken right now to have the U.S. return.
So, Aaron, Professor Benavot, on behalf of the Association of Former UNESCO staff members, of which I'm an active member, and we're a large community dedicated to UNESCO and to other things related to education and culture and science. Thank you very, very much for your time, and thank you for being here for us.
My pleasure. Thank you very
Goodbye.
much. Bye.